2,000 years ago, in a remote part of the Roman Empire, a man was born who would change the history of the world, Jesus.
He was seen from the very beginning as this extremely radical, revolutionary figure that was going to bring more change than they had seen since the time of the prophets.
After a life of wandering through the hills and villages of Galilee and Judea, preaching and healing, Jesus was betrayed, arrested, and brutally put to death.
Jesus' death on the cross was hugely difficult for the early Christians. It was extremely embarrassing to say that they were followers of a leader who had been crucified.
But in the years after his crucifixion, Jesus' story was written down by his followers to help explain his extraordinary life and death. These four Gospels would later form a major part of the Christian Bible and enable his message to be spread all over the world.
It's just extraordinary to come here now and see these crowds who've come from all over the world still being drawn by the power of that moment that would change everything.
This is very exciting, Vi. We have people who are still so skeptical that they claim there's no Nazareth in the first century.
But for hundreds of years, scholars have been trying to look behind the Jesus of the Gospels, the divine Christ of faith, to uncover the historical figure, a Mediterranean Jew who lived and died as a man, and according to his followers, was resurrected from the dead.
This is absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, they knew what we call the laws of nature just as much as we do. They knew that dead people stay dead.
In this series, 9 top biblical experts will re-examine the Gospel accounts to uncover the original meaning of the story of Jesus through the eyes of the people for whom it was first written almost 2,000 years ago.
This is a story too improbable not to be true. It's because it's not what you'd make up if you're starting a new world religion.
The climax of Jesus' life took place during one of the most important and highly charged times of the Jewish year. It was the holy festival of the Passover, when Jews celebrated the Exodus, in which, according to the Hebrew Bible, they had been freed from slavery in Egypt thousands of years before. According to the 4 Gospel accounts of his life, Jesus was a Jew who grew up with his parents in Galilee, a province in the Roman Empire. As a young adult, he joined the movement of John the Baptist and was baptized by him in the River Jordan, where he had an extraordinary visionary experience. After John's arrest and execution, Jesus formed his own movement and quickly gained a reputation as a healer and performer of spectacular miracles. Jesus was also a teacher, a Jewish rabbi with a mission to reform the world in which he lived. Based in a small fishing village on the shores of Lake Galilee, he wandered the land, preaching a particular message that challenged the status quo and brought him into direct conflict with the ruling powers. These gospel accounts of his life were full of references to events and prophecies in the Old Testament that gave Jesus' story a greater meaning for their original first century audience. That he was the Messiah they had been waiting for, the Saviour who would liberate them from all their troubles. According to 3 of the Gospels, the final 24 hours of Jesus' life began when, like thousands of other Jews, he and his disciples sat down for a Passover meal.
The normal Passover meal had a variety of symbolic elements. There is the bitter herbs that helped you remember the bitterness of bondage in Egypt. There was the unleavened bread or bread of haste, which reminded what haste they had to leave the land once they were set free. But most importantly, there was the Passover lamb, because it was the blood of the lamb that led to the sparing of them from the judgment that fell on Egypt.
This meal is now known as one of the most iconic Christian events, commemorated in countless famous paintings. Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples before his death. It also provided a ritual that symbolized how the gospel writers believed true redemption could now come only through Jesus, through his death on the cross, what later became the central act of Christian worship, the Eucharist.
Jesus reinterprets several of the elements of the Passover, the bread, which would have been unleavened bread, and one of the cups of wine, in terms of his own body and his own blood. And what is most incredible about this is that Jesus is offering his disciples the benefits of his passion, of his death, in advance dying. One of the things scholars are in general agreement on is that the first part of the Gospels to be written down were the Passion narratives. And at least 33% of the Gospel focuses just on that last week of Jesus' life. The Gospel writers knew the part of the story they absolutely had to explain and get straight was this unexpected ending to the story of Jesus. For ancient peoples, including Jews, believed that how a person died most revealed their character.
After saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, "Truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me."
Among other things, it's on this night that Jesus himself says, someone who's sitting here and supping with us this night, my intimate band of friends, is going to betray me. And the disciples are asking, surely it's not I, surely it's not I. And so what was intended to be a joyful celebration turns into a very somber occasion.
The Gospels of Matthew, Mark and Luke agree closely on the events of the Last Supper, but the Gospel of John includes a ritual of foot washing and then has Jesus making a long and passionate farewell speech to his followers.
This required a lot of explanation. Crucified Messiah would have been seen as a contradiction in terms. They weren't looking for a hero who would become a zero by dying on a cross, the most shameful way and humiliating way to death. Historians believe the more difficult the story becomes, the more likely it has profound historical substance, because it's not what you'd make up if you're starting a new world religion.
Every year at Easter, thousands of Christian pilgrims come to Jerusalem to reenact the climax of Jesus' life, the Passion. As the story has it, Jesus is arrested, condemned to die, then paraded through the streets of Jerusalem, bearing the cross on which he will be executed. These final hours of Jesus' life and his agonizing crucifixion have become the central symbol of Christianity. Commemorated again and again in churches throughout the world, in sermons and processions, in music, in drama, and in every sort of art.
Jesus' death on the cross was hugely difficult for the early Christians. It was extremely embarrassing to say that they were followers of a leader who had been crucified, this deeply humiliating penalty. The Apostle Paul talks about it as folly and a stumbling block, and it was very difficult, something that they had to make sense of.
Most scholars agree that the first part of Jesus' life to be recorded and written down was the Passion narrative, and that it is the most historically accurate part of his story because it was so awkward to explain. According to tradition, a Messiah was not expected to die in agony on the cross. He was supposed to triumph over his enemies. And for that reason, many scholars are convinced that despite the differences in detail between the four gospel accounts, the core story must be true.
Part of the disagreement, I think, has to do with the fact that they're written from individual perspectives, and the fact that there is disagreement, I think, validates in some ways the authenticity of the Gospels rather than decreases or diminishes their value. If we looked at the Gospels and they were to record the same events using the exact same language, And the immediate reaction might be, this is collusion.
The final 24 hours of Jesus' life are recounted in the Gospels in minute detail. The narrative becomes a blow-by-blow, almost minute-by-minute account, combining historical fact with theological reflection on the meaning and purpose of Jesus' death. The final act begins with his arrest just outside Jerusalem. And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled.
King James Version of Mark's text says something like, immediately upon entering the garden, he begins to feel sore amazed and to feel very heavy. The phrase sore amazed is taken from a Greek word, ekthambesthai, which might be more appropriately translated as terrified surprise, indicating to us that Jesus doesn't know what was to engulf him when he went into the Garden of Gethsemane. And it's quite possible to see that he's having some doubts.
While he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them.
Judas is a very strange character in the Gospels. Right from the very beginning, the moment we're introduced to him, we're told that he was the one who betrayed Jesus. So there's never any uncertainty about that. One of the difficulties in the Gospel texts is that we're not specifically told by our earliest source, Mark's Gospel, why Judas did it. It's completely inexplicable. Some people suggest that what Judas was actually trying to do was to force Jesus' hand, to get him to appear before the high priest, and to push Jesus into openly declaring who he was. Maybe Judas was hoping for a more political kingdom and got disillusioned with Jesus. Some people have suggested that Judas was even doing Jesus' bidding here, and ironically, in a way, is that if it hadn't been for Judas and his betrayal, none of the final events of Jesus' life would ever have happened.
Of all the canonical Gospels, Matthew is the only one that explains to us Judas's fate after his great act of betrayal. Matthew says that he's seized with remorse. He realizes that he's shed innocent blood. He goes back to the chief priests and he makes this great confession. And the chief priests aren't particularly interested in his confession. He wants to give the money back. And the chief priests essentially say, "That's your affair. You must take care of that."
Judas has always been seen as the archetypal evil man, the bad guy of history. Even though when he sees what happens to Jesus, he goes away and hangs himself and presumably feels a certain amount of remorse for that, he's never really been forgiven. Dante put him at the very center of hell. He is the most evil man that ever existed. And for a lot of people too, I think the idea that anybody who met Jesus could then have passed him over to executioners is beyond anything that people can imagine.
Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard."
The kiss, which has become famous in story, in song, in art, the Judas kiss, the kiss of betrayal, was a tremendously symbolic act. A kiss in Old Testament times was symbolic of reconciliation between estranged parties. For example, Jacob and Esau have been estranged for 20 years. When they finally meet back together again, the book of Genesis tells us that Esau runs to Jacob to greet him. He falls on his neck, kisses him, and weeps. And now when Judas steps forward and gives him a kiss, this highly symbolic act of reconciliation, of appreciation, of honor, Judas turns the kiss on its head. and it becomes this act of betrayal.
Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered.
We actually know very little about Caiaphas as a historical character. He was high priest of the Jews, which meant that he was the spokesman for Jews everywhere. He also had general oversight over the temple. He was probably from a prominent aristocratic Jerusalem family. He married into the family of Annas, the most influential high priest of the first century. He was also presumably one of the most successful high priests of the first century because he managed to carry on in the post for 19 years, which is significantly longer than any of the other incumbents. One of Caiaphas's main duties was to make sure that all was quiet in Jerusalem. In many ways, he had the same interests as the Roman governor. If everything was quiet, there were no riots, there was no disruption of the temple, and it meant that everything could continue smoothly. And so I think that was one of the reasons why Caiaphas was very interested when Jesus went into the temple and overturned the money changers there. And he was also saying things about the temple. He was talking about the temple's imminent destruction. And I think that kind of thing would very much have worried Caiaphas, particularly given the fact that it's Passover, Jesus is there with a following. It's a very volatile situation. Each gospel writer has his own take on the Jewish trial. So, for example, Matthew is very keen to show that it was actually the Jewish authorities, in fact, even the Jewish people themselves, who were responsible for the death of Jesus. Luke is very keen to show that Jesus is innocent. Mark wants to stress Jewish involvement in Jesus' death. And so I think that whole scene that he has of the formal nighttime Jewish trial is very much exaggerated. It's very dramatic. It's very ironic too. It's almost a kangaroo court in which all the normal laws of legal proceedings are completely thrown out of the window.
They're looking for a charge to convict Jesus so that they can put him to death. There seems to be a lack of fairness, a lack of complete openness with this arraignment. And it seems to have been a premeditated decision that Jesus is going to be put to death, but we need to find the right reason. Finally, the text tells us that two witnesses step forward, and they indicate that they've heard Jesus say, "I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build it again." In other words, there's divine intervention involved. And this essentially amounts to a messianic claim. And by claiming to be the Messiah, Jesus will be guilty of blasphemy in front of his Jewish accusers.
Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you mean."
The basic story that Peter denied Jesus may well be true, but it's certainly, as we have it in the Gospels, it's been embellished. And I think part of what the story is doing is speaking to Christians at the time when the Gospels were written in the late first century. It's Christians who themselves were perhaps being called upon to accept or to deny Christianity. It was a difficult time for Christians and they had to stand firm. And what the Gospel writers are doing is to say, you have to stand firm. But if you don't, then you can see what happened to Peter. Even the closest of Jesus' disciples sometimes didn't have quite enough bravery, didn't have quite enough faith.
Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, the King."
Pilate is always seen as the reluctant judge, the one who doesn't want to put Jesus to death, but is pushed into it by his Jewish subjects. There's good reasons, though, to think that that account in the Gospels may well have suffered from a certain amount of Christian embellishment. And that's because we do have other accounts of Pilate, particularly in the Jewish writer Josephus, and also in a contemporary of Pilate's called Philo of Alexandria. And both of them paint a rather different picture of Pilate. In both of them, he's a much harsher, insensitive, intolerant governor who expects to be boss in his own province. Philo, in particular, is very negative about him. He describes him as greedy, abusive, violent, and he says that his term of office was nothing but a series of atrocities. I think it would be very difficult to give this kind of a character description of Pilate if it was generally known that he was a weakling, that he was a soft touch. And so I think the truth is probably somewhere in between, that he was a reasonably competent governor. He lasted 10 years in the province, which actually was quite a long time for a provincial governor at the time.
Jesus is now standing in front of Pontius Pilate. He's the Roman prefect. But he's got a very challenging political circumstance to deal with in the man Jesus standing in front of him. He tells the Jewish authorities, "I don't find any fault in this man."
One of the main things that the Gospel writers are trying to do in the Roman trial narrative is to take blame for the death of Jesus away from the Roman governor and to put it as squarely as possible onto the Jewish chief priests. And I think the reason for that is because when they're writing in the late 1st century, Christianity is now finding its converts amongst the Gentiles, the non-Jews, some of whom are Roman citizens. And I think the last thing that these people want to be told is that the founder of this new movement was somebody who ended up on a Roman cross.
And the Jewish crowd says this man has been fomenting against Rome ever since his days in Galilee. And finally, when Pontius Pilate hears Galilee, his ears perk up because he's trying to shuttle Jesus off to some other authority. And so at this point, the text of Luke, in a unique passage, says that Jesus is taken to Herod Antipas, who is a son of Herod the Great. Herod Antipas is a tetrarch, a ruler over a fourth part, who has under his control Galilee and Perea. Herod Antipas is the only person we know of in the New Testament who has a face-to-face audience with Jesus, a face-to-face confrontation, to whom Jesus never says a word. I think what we see in Jesus' silence towards Herod Antipas is contempt. He's not going to dignify Herod Antipas's questions with a response. Herod Antipas has been the one that has executed Jesus' cousin John the Baptist over in Perea in a little hillside fortress called Machaerus.
According to Luke's Gospel, Herod Antipas then sends Jesus back to Pilate for final sentencing. So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." According to all the Gospels, Jesus is now handed over to the Roman soldiers, who begin a series of deliberately degrading and painful punishments. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him.
The whole point of these stories is to underline the mockery there. The soldiers are mocking him as King of the Jews, whereas the readers, of course, know that Jesus truly is the King of the Jews, not because he's claiming any political messiahship, but precisely because of his non-violent proclamation of the kingdom of God.
So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross.
Jesus carries his own crossbeam through the streets of Jerusalem to the place of crucifixion. That was quite normal. Crucified victims normally carried the crossbeam.
That's called in Latin the patibulum. This is a big, heavy chunk of olive wood that is put on the ground, and when the person to be executed is there, that person would be thrown to the ground, and he either be tied or nailed to the patibulum.
But as he goes through Jerusalem, he's unable to continue carrying it. And according to Mark's Gospel, he's helped out by Simon of Cyrene, who steps in and carries the crossbeam for him. John's Gospel, though, has a different slant on things. In his Gospel, there's no Simon of Cyrene. Jesus carries the crossbeam himself. All the way through John's narrative, Jesus is a magisterial, sovereign figure who needs no help from anybody else.
Today, when Christian pilgrims process through Old Jerusalem along the Via Dolorosa, they are following a route only established in the 18th century. Archaeologist Dr. Shimon Gibson believes the real route that Jesus was forced to take to his execution is very different.
Well, the traditional Via Dolorosa begins at the Antonia Fortress, which is on the north of the Temple Mount area, and then it winds its way through the streets of Jerusalem to the area of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre of today, from the area of the Antonia all the way towards the southwest. We're here in the opposite direction. We're at the Praetorium, the old palace of Herod the Great. As I said, most scholars accept that this is the historical location, which means then that the Via Dolorosa has to begin at this point. In fact, if you look at it, this is probably the point where the Ecce Homo, you know, this
behold
is
the man.
Yes, behold the man. This is probably where it took place. And so today you have the Via Dolorosa beginning, if we accept this as this archaeological and historical evidence, then we have the Via Dolorosa beginning here. It winds its way through the Armenian car park of today, and
just
then
the other side of the wall,
just the other side of the medieval wall of today, and then it sort of extends through the city to the Genat Gate, the Garden Gate. And now, what does this mean in terms of the traditional Via Dolorosa that for where many Christians sort of go to pray and they follow the different stations? Well, the traditions relating to that Via Dolorosa go back to the Crusader period, and one has to make a distinction, I think, between a place where you go in order to profess your faith and a place where you go to actually observe the historical accuracy relating to the exact path that Jesus took when he was being led through the city prior to his crucifixion. You start here and you end up at Golgotha there at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. If you want to relate your faith to others and to yourself in terms of the traditions, the Christian traditions, then you go along the traditional Via Dolorosa. There's nothing wrong about that. But one has to take into account that from my perspective, as somebody who deals with the historicity of it all, the other Via Dolorosa dates back to the Crusade period, and there's a clear reason why it's established there.
Catholic churches are famous for the Stations of the Cross. In all it, which is the Via Dolorosa, in all of them, Jesus is impeccable. His hair is beautifully done, beard trimmed, garments don't have a stain or a tear, there's no evidence of blood, and slung over one shoulder is a dinky little cross. But this was torture, and we refuse to take it seriously. See, we refuse to accept the full humanity of Jesus. We want him to be a Superman or God. But to take him for what he was, then that's too difficult, because then we'd have to do the same.
For most modern people, the cross is just a symbol. I think we've lost that sense of just how horrendous a thing it was.
And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him. And the criminals, one on his right and one on his left.
Jesus was crucified between two other criminals. We don't know exactly what their crime was. Maybe they were robbers or bandits. But I think the fact that he's there with these criminals just gives an indication of what Rome thought about him. He was the lowest of the low. He was just a common, ordinary criminal. And that's the image, I think, that you get from those three crosses.
Archaeologist Shimon Gibson believes that although the traditional Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem is almost certainly the correct location for Jesus' crucifixion, the exact place within the church is still a mystery.
The Rock of Calvary, which is shown today in the Church of Holy Sepulchre, in my opinion, isn't the place of the crucifixion. It marks the spot. It's a bit like, you know, an X on a treasure map or something like that. But the place of the crucifixion, I believe, was below the church, which was built by Constantine the Great, and presumably in the area of the apse. So if one was to excavate, then I think you would find the place where it was believed in the Byzantine period that crucifixion took place.
And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last.
Luke changes the account of Jesus' death slightly, and so in this gospel, Jesus dies forgiving his enemies. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And that very much fits in with a Lucan theme of forgiveness. In John's Gospel too, you have a rather different picture. The magisterial Jesus, who's laid down his life for his friends, ends it all with the words, "It is finished." He's not abandoned by everyone, as he is in the others, but his closest follower, the beloved disciple, and his mother are also there at the foot of the cross, symbolically in a way representing the Christian community that's going to come after him.
It is clear from the Gospels that for Jesus' disciples, his death on the cross was a complete shock and trauma. Messiahs were not supposed to die. Archbishop Theophilos is head of the oldest Christian denomination in Jerusalem, the Greek Orthodox Church.
Well, I mean, they've had great expectations in the person of Jesus, because according to sacred history, they were aware of the coming of the Messiah. And of course, the Messiah was described not as an earthly king or ruler, but as a divine person, right? And to see him being humiliated in such a way, it was for them too much. I mean, resurrection would have been of no significance, of no importance, if it wasn't connected, associated with the crucifixion. Why? Because it is in this event, the moment of the crucifixion, that one can see God's philanthropy. And here shows that God again is for the whole humanity. Yes. So in crucifixion, what you have there, that God, he himself becomes, assumes humanity, he accepts to be sacrificed, right? To be totally humiliated in the most offensive, in the most worst way, in order to save his own creatures, his own creation.
One fundamental aspect of how the Gospels recorded Jesus' death has dogged Christianity ever since they were first written. Who was to blame? And above all, can his death really be laid at the feet of the Jewish nation? And all the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children."
That's a terrible cry that's had a disastrous legacy for generations afterwards. Historically, it may simply be that Matthew had in mind the fall of Jerusalem, which happened just before he wrote his Gospel. And so perhaps what he's wanting his readers to think is that the fall of Jerusalem was actually the punishment on these Jews and their children. But of course, once you take these texts out of their original historical context, they begin to mean something different. And that's had disastrous repercussions, even right down to the modern period. This cry has fueled Christian anti-Semitism down through the ages. The Jews as a group, as a nation, have been charged with deicide, with killing God, killing Jesus.
I think that's an untenable position. First of all, Jesus was a Jew. Second of all, members of his inner circle, the 12 disciples, were Jews. Third, all of the members of the early Christian community were all Jews. So it simply does not hold to accuse the Jewish people of the death of Jesus.
After Jesus had died, all the Gospel accounts agree that as evening came, he was taken down off the cross, and as was customary for first-century Jews, his body was placed in a nearby tomb. But it was not his own family tomb as he came from Galilee. It belonged instead to a wealthy man, Joseph of Arimathea, who, according to the Gospels, had gone to Pilate for permission to remove Jesus' body.
Joseph of Arimathea is really interesting because he becomes more and more Christian as the Gospels go on. In the earliest Gospel, Mark's Gospel, he's just a member of the Jerusalem Council. He's looking for the kingdom of God, but there's no indication that he's a follower of Jesus. Gradually, though, we're told in Luke's Gospel that he wasn't consenting to what the chief priests did. And then finally, he becomes a follower of Jesus. We're told specifically that he's a disciple. So there's a progressive Christianization of Joseph of Arimathea. Historically, I think it's probably likely that he wasn't a follower of Jesus. Quite possibly his job was to dispose of the bodies of criminals, because it was an offence against the Jewish law for the body of a criminal to remain on a cross overnight. So they may well have needed somebody like Joseph to make sure that all of these dead bodies were taken down and given some kind of a burial before nightfall.
The first thing we need to remember is that Jesus was most certainly very dead. Some people think, oh, maybe he actually didn't really die on the cross. We have to remember that the Roman soldiers were professional killers. That's what they did for a living, and especially they were good at killing people who were rebel leaders, which is how they saw Jesus. So there's no question Jesus was very definitely dead. Then the fun starts, because after a comparatively short while, a couple of nights or so, he is found to be very thoroughly alive again.
All the Gospels again agree on what happens next, the most important and controversial event in Jesus' life, a fact that is central to a belief in Christianity, when Jesus is supposed to have come back from the dead. Now after the Sabbath, towards the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb.
But the critical thing is this. In the first century, the word resurrection, the Greek word and the Hebrew or Aramaic words that they would have used, had nothing to do with going to heaven or that his spirit was still alive or anything like that. The word resurrection is all about bodies. It's about something definitely physical, concrete, actual. And so somehow we have to say this person who was very thoroughly dead, they firmly believed was actually bodily alive again. And the evidence of that was that the tomb was empty.
Jesus' resurrection is seen by many scholars as a symbolic event, something that was intended to represent Christianity's rise from the ashes of Jesus' brutal death. But Tom Wright believes it really did happen, that it was an historical event, that the people who originally witnessed it both believed and recorded as fact.
So that's what they believed happened, even though they knew, just as we do, that this is absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, it's another thing we have to remind ourselves. They knew what we call the laws of nature just as much as we do. They knew that dead people stay dead. They weren't just sort of thinking, oh yes, people pop back all the time. They knew perfectly well they didn't. So that for them, this was as much of a shock and of a stupid thing to go around saying as it is for us today. And yet they insisted it has happened. And this is the meaning and the beginning of everything.
In the last Gospel, John, the first person to see the resurrected Jesus, is one of his closest disciples. But it's not Peter or John, but Mary Magdalene. She turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?"
Now, if somebody 10 years, 15 years, 50 years later was going to say, well, it'd be nice if we could get that Jesus movement going again. He's obviously around somewhere, he's alive in some sense, so why don't we say he's raised from the dead? If you were doing that, you would never, ever, ever make up a story with a woman who has whatever sort of a dodgy past, we're not quite sure, but a woman anyway, because sadly in that world women were not credible witnesses in law courts. Nobody would have made it up like that. They are a real sign that something was definitely happening.
Each of the four Gospels also contains similar dramatic experiences relating how many of his followers met the resurrected Jesus. As they were talking about these things, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace to you." But they were startled and frightened and thought they saw a spirit.
When we look at those stories, they haven't been polished up. They haven't had lots of nice scriptural embellishment. They sound quite sort of breathless and naked and unadorned, and they're not quite like the stories earlier in the Gospels, or revelation or dream stories that we have in secular literature, which you might have thought if they were going into a sort of a trance or a visionary state. And so there's a sense in the stories which of Jesus being somehow transformed. And it is as though they're trying very hard to tell us something for which they know they haven't got very good language. And that our words are now being strained to cope with this new thing. And precisely because it wasn't what anyone was expecting, they're not just making it up to conform to something that people had imagined. They're saying, oh my goodness, this is a whole new world. What are we going to do about it?
For Tom Wright, the resurrection is the single historical event that not only gives Jesus' life story its full meaning, but also accounts for the spectacular rise of Christianity in the 3 centuries after his death.
Why did the movement that came to be called Christianity start? Why did it take the shape it did? And why particularly did it call Jesus Messiah? Christ, Christos in Greek, which is Messiah in Hebrew, the Anointed One. If we ask all of the early Christians, why are you saying this ridiculous stuff? They say with one voice, well, because he was raised from the dead.
Unlike today, in the first century world of the Gospels, religion was not a separate aspect of life, but something that defined it, helping people to make sense of the brutal and unforgiving world in which they lived. And every stage of Jesus' life that the Gospels recorded was imbued with that message.
In today's world, we understand about spin. And in the ancient world, spin was called rhetoric. And it was expected. If you were telling a story, you were going to make it partly a rhetorical story. You were going to shape it for its meaning.
Of course, the distinctive thing about the Gospels is that they're biographies of a very particular person, not someone who's one of a series of sons of God, but one who's unique. And so this sort of drives the production of the Gospels. And the message of the Gospels, of course, is that this particular Jesus Christ is the Son of God who went on to die and rise again and bring salvation to the world.
Here's a man who has messianic pretensions, performs all these miracles, has all these wonderful sayings, and then he ends up on a Roman cross, which was seen as the most shameful way to die. How is it possible that he could be either the Son of Man or the Son of God or Messiah or anything special at all? Well, the gospel writers had to explain how that could be so, how this apparent contradiction could in fact be God's way of dealing with the problem of sin and atoning for the sins of the world. And so that's why they had to spend so much time telling this last week of Jesus' story, because it ends in a way that could have appeared to be a disaster.
Imagine if you're a first century Jew soaked in the scriptures of the Old Testament. You've got a narrative in your head which is waiting to get where it's got to go. And it's a narrative about God, about Israel, about the world, and in particular about all the pain and suffering and wickedness and degradation that's in the world, and God having promised to do something about it, big time. Then you've got the four Gospels which tell the story of Jesus as the fulfillment of that longer story which you've been waiting for. That this was how the living God would become King of the world.
For centuries, scholars have been weighing up the facts about Jesus' life to evaluate the evidence for and against the accuracy of the differing accounts. But if we examine his life story through the eyes of his original first century followers, there is no contradiction between the Jesus of history and the Christ of Christian faith. Because for them, the Gospel's account of his life is the real story of Jesus.